I grew up in rural Idaho, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and outdoor work is just a part of life. After high school, I took a job with a small trail clearing company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough for someone who didn't want to sit behind a desk. We mostly worked contracts from the Forest Service, clearing old or overgrown hiking paths deep in the state's vast national forests. In the summer of 2021, we were assigned to a project that still gives me chills to this day. It was supposed to be straightforward, clear out a 12-mile trail that had been abandoned for over a decade. The route ran along the base of the Sawtooth Mountains and had become nearly invisible due to fallen trees, dense brush, and erosion. The job was remote, even by our standards. We had to drive 3 hours down a dirt logging road just to reach the trailhead. From there, it was a 3-day hike-in to where the work was supposed to begin. We had satellite phones, gas-powered saws, and food packed for a week. Everything was packed with care. Rick, our boss, was particular about equipment checklists, and Joey double-checked the med kits and fuel tanks. There were 5 of us. My boss, Rick, a quiet guy named Marcus, a former ranger named Joey, and my childhood friend Aaron. Rick and Joey were seasoned, having done wilderness work for decades. Marcus was new, like me, and didn't talk much. Aaron and I were mostly excited to be out of cell service for a while. The group dynamic was easy, until it wasn't. Things were fine the first few days. The hike-in was brutal, but the scenery was incredible. We moved through thick pine forests, across cold streams, and up steep ridges. The deeper we got, though, the stranger it became. We started noticing little things, scratched symbols on trees, rocks stacked in unnatural ways, and once, a necklace hanging from a branch that none of us dared touch. Rick dismissed it as some hippie hiker ritual, but Marcus was visibly uneasy. Joey said he'd seen similar things in areas with squatter activity and warned us not to wander off the trail. It wasn't unusual for drug addicts or fugitives to hide out in forests, and Joey had a few horror stories from his time as a ranger. On day 4, we set up camp near a stream and began work early the next morning. That's when Marcus first mentioned hearing voices. He said he'd been up late and heard what sounded like 2 people arguing in the trees. None of us heard it, but it clearly rattled him. He didn't sleep the next night and drank 2 cans of an energy drink to stay awake. Rick scolded him the next morning for slacking off on clearing brush. That afternoon, Joey found something about half a mile from camp while clearing underbrush. It was a small lean-to shelter, hidden behind thick pine. Inside were empty cans, broken glass, and a rain-soaked sleeping bag. It looked like it hadn't been used in months, but nearby, we found fresh footprints in the mud. Rick was the one who found the prints. "Bare feet," he muttered, crouching to inspect them. "No shoes." We stared at each other, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell was walking barefoot out here? We didn't bring it up again, but nobody slept well that night. Aaron kept his headlamp on the entire time. Marcus started sleeping with a hatchet beside him. On the 6th day, things escalated. I was clearing a narrow switchback when I saw something that made me freeze. Nailed to a tree, about 5 feet off the ground, was a doll, a human-shaped rag doll, filthy and weather-worn. Its button eyes were missing, and something dark was smeared around its mouth. Red or brown, I couldn't tell. I called for Joey. He came over, looked at it, and simply said, "Take a photo, leave it alone." We kept clearing the trail, but it was slower. Everyone was distracted. Aaron whispered to me that he'd seen someone standing between the trees the night before, just beyond the firelight. Said it didn't look like a man exactly, too tall and too thin. He didn't want to tell Rick, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Marcus began muttering to himself at night, and I heard him crying once. That night, around 2 a.m., our satellite phone buzzed. It was supposed to stay off unless we had an emergency. Rick answered it and listened for a long time before hanging up without saying anything. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. At breakfast, he told us that the Forest Service had received a signal ping from a nearby emergency beacon, one that hadn't been issued in nearly 12 years. "Might be a fluke," he said. "Might not." We packed early and pushed deeper into the trail, knowing our time was almost up. The final morning, Marcus didn't come out of his tent. Rick unzipped it and found him curled in a ball, eyes wide open, lips moving silently. He was shaking like he'd been electrocuted. Joey tried to calm him down, but Marcus just kept whispering the same thing over and over. They watch when we sleep. They wait when we stop. We carried him out that day. No way were we staying another night. He didn't respond to us, didn't eat or speak, just stared ahead, whispering to himself. On the second night of hiking back, Aaron thought he saw someone following us. When we turned around, nothing was there. 3 miles from the trailhead, we found the campsite, not ours, someone else's. It was crude, scattered with torn fabric and bones. Animal bones, we hoped. A burned Bible lay among the ashes of the fire pit, and several trees had been carved with circles, symbols none of us recognized. Joey took out his phone but put it away when Rick told him not to take pictures. "We don't want any of this following us home," he said. Rick ordered us not to take pictures. We picked up our pace and didn't stop until we reached the truck. When we got back into cell range, Joey called the Forest Service and reported everything. The response? That trail isn't in our system anymore. They refused to send anyone to investigate. 2 weeks later, Marcus checked into a psychiatric facility. Aaron doesn't talk about the trip anymore. Rick quit the company, and Joey moved out of state. I tried to write about what happened once, but the words never came out right. I still work trails, but I'll never go back to that stretch of forest. Even now, when I go out alone, I carry extra batteries, a weapon, and a whistle, just in case. The weirdest part, 2 months later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo of me, standing in the trees, alone. The photo had been taken from maybe 20 feet away. I had no memory of it being taken. On the back, written in red ink, was a single sentence: "You left the others behind." To this day, I don't know who sent it. I don't know what happened to Marcus's mind, or who, or what, was out there watching us. But I know this. Some trails are left abandoned for a reason, and some warnings aren't meant to be ignored. I'm 27 now, but this happened when I was 25. I was working part-time as a vet tech in Asheville, while also trying to build a freelance portfolio in pet behavior consultation. On weekends, I offered house and pet sitting services to make some extra cash. Most of my gigs came from referrals or a local Facebook group for pet owners. That's how I got in touch with a man named Mr. Langston. Mr. Langston was in his early 60s and lived alone in a large, older home on the outskirts of the city. He owned a black cat named Salem and a cockatoo named Benny. He said he'd be out of town for a long weekend visiting his daughter in Tennessee and needed someone to watch over his pets and keep the house company. He was offering $325 for 3 nights, and that sounded more than fair to me. When I arrived for the walkthrough, Mr. Langston gave me a tour. The house was dimly lit even in daylight, and most of the furnishings looked like they hadn't changed since the 1980s. Still, everything was clean, and the pets seemed well cared for. Benny squawked and shouted phrases like, "Where's my coffee?" and "Hey buddy," while Salem eyed me from behind the stairs. He instructed me to feed Salem twice daily, give Benny fresh fruit and pellets, and let him out of his cage for a few hours each day. There was a guest bedroom upstairs next to the main bathroom, and he said I could use the kitchen freely. The only rule was to stay out of the last room at the end of the hallway upstairs. It was locked anyway, he said, but he preferred no one tried to go near it. That struck me as odd, but not alarming. People have storage rooms. Maybe it was messy or private. He left Friday morning, and by that evening, I had settled in. Salem kept to himself, and Benny chattered intermittently from the den. The first night went fine, though I was hyper-aware of how quiet the house got at night. Every creak echoed. I left the bedroom door open in case Salem wanted to wander in. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of soft thuds, like something falling lightly on the floor. I sat up, heart racing, but after a few moments of silence, I lay back down. I figured it was Benny moving around in his cage, or maybe Salem knocking something off a counter. The next day was uneventful. I cleaned the litter box, changed Benny's water, and let him out to perch on the curtain rod. He mimicked a cough a few times and said, "Don't go in there once," which made me pause, but I assumed he had picked that up from TV or Mr. Langston. Still, it gave me the chills. I left for about an hour that afternoon to run to the store and came back to find Salem staring at the staircase. His tail was puffed, and he didn't move even when I called him. Benny was silent. I walked up slowly, feeling nervous for no good reason. I didn't hear anything unusual, but something about the air upstairs felt heavy. That night, I fell asleep with my bedroom lamp on. I had just started to drift off when I heard footsteps in the hallway, measured, slow, deliberate. My blood ran cold. I strained to hear more, but the steps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I couldn't bring myself to look. After what felt like minutes, Benny suddenly screeched from downstairs. "He's here!" Over and over again. I leapt out of bed and slammed the door shut, locking it. The footsteps didn't resume, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, the hallway looked empty. I checked on Benny, who was uncharacteristically quiet, and Salem was hiding under the couch. I texted Mr. Langston to ask if anyone might have had access to the house. He didn't respond. That afternoon, I decided to leave early. I packed my bag and fed the animals one last time. As I went upstairs to grab my charger, I noticed the door at the end of the hall was cracked open. It had definitely been locked before. I stood frozen. A faint smell, like mold and old perfume, drifted out. My brain screamed at me to leave it alone, but I walked slowly toward the door. Inside was a room covered in floral wallpaper, dim with only a sliver of light coming through the curtains. There was a small twin bed, dusty porcelain dolls on a shelf, and a rocking chair facing the wall. And it was rocking. I didn't go in. I turned and ran, grabbing my stuff and leaving the key under the mat. I didn't lock the door. I didn't care. Later that night, I got a voicemail from Mr. Langston. He sounded casual, thanking me and asking how the pets did. I never returned the call. A week later, he left a glowing review in the Facebook group, but I never responded. I still think about that room, about the words Benny said, and about the footsteps that stopped just outside my door. Whatever was at the end of that hallway, I never want to meet it again. My name is Julian, and I've worked for the MTA in New York City for almost 20 years. Currently, I'm a night shift transit operations supervisor, which basically means I'm responsible for checking station operations during the overnight hours. It's not glamorous, but I've always preferred the quiet of night. Fewer people, less noise, until it gets a little too quiet. This happened during one of my shifts last spring. I was doing my usual rounds, transferring between stations via train, something we're allowed to do for supervision purposes. I had just boarded a local train from the 145th Street station around 2:50 a.m. It was one of those deep, echoing stations where sound travels strangely, and there's never anyone on the platform at that hour. I boarded the last car of the train. It was empty. Not unusual for that time, but you always get a slight chill in your spine when you realize you're the only person in an entire subway car, with nothing but fluorescent hums and the occasional screech of brakes to accompany you. At the next stop, 125th Street, a man boarded. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a heavy black trench coat despite the mild spring weather. He had a wool cap pulled low over his forehead and stringy brown hair that fell just below his ears. He made immediate eye contact with me as soon as he stepped in, then walked all the way to the opposite end of the car and sat down, still facing me. Something about him unsettled me right away. It wasn't just how he looked, it was how calculated he seemed. He didn't take out a phone, didn't fidget, didn't even glance out the window. He just sat there, occasionally glancing up at me from beneath his cap. I tried to look occupied with the notes I had for my shift schedule, but I could feel his gaze even when I wasn't looking. When we arrived at the next station, 96th Street, I got off, as planned. I walked briskly toward the station manager's office on the mezzanine level. As I approached the door, I glanced over my shoulder. And there he was, the man from the train. He was pacing slowly near the benches, about 30 feet away. Not sitting, not heading toward any exit, just pacing. I unlocked the office door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. I tried to dismiss the growing paranoia in my chest, telling myself he was just waiting for another train. But a few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a hand testing the doorknob. It jiggled once, then again. Then came a knock. slow, deliberate, not forceful. I called out, "Can I help you?" "I just want to talk," came the voice. Low, calm, measured, too measured. I replied firmly, "Please leave the area." There was silence for a moment, then another soft knock. I moved quickly to the wall monitor and pulled up the feed from the hallway camera. There he was, standing right outside the door, just as I'd feared. Still wearing that long trench coat, still keeping his head down like he was trying to avoid the camera, until he wasn't. As soon as I pulled up the footage, he looked directly at the lens. Then just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing out of view. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. I stayed in the office for about 30 more minutes, finishing my report and waiting for the next train to transfer to my third and final check-in of the night. Before leaving, I double-checked the cameras. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I exited, locked the office, and descended the steps to the platform. The train arrived just as I reached the bottom. I stepped in, relieved to see the car was empty again. That relief didn't last long. As the train doors began to close, I caught movement from the stairs. The man from before, his coat trailing behind him, descended and stepped into the same car as me just before the doors shut. He sat down across from me again, not directly opposite, but offset, just enough to keep me within his peripheral vision. I tried not to show it, but my nerves were on fire. I could feel his stare again, and it took everything in me not to get up and move to another car. I didn't want to provoke him. I didn't know if he had a weapon. And the look in his eyes, sharp, calculating, devoid of empathy, made me suspect he wouldn't hesitate to use one. Trying to diffuse the tension, I gave a nod and a forced half-smile. He didn't return it. He just kept watching. The train continued. I didn't move a muscle until we arrived at my next stop, 59th Street. As soon as the doors opened, I practically sprinted up the stairs, forcing myself not to look back. But I could hear him, footsteps echoing up behind me. I reached the surface and made a beeline for the nearest open establishment, a 24-hour diner on the corner. I stepped inside and took a seat at the counter, pretending to study the menu. A moment later, I saw his reflection in the glass of the dessert case. He had stopped just outside the window. He didn't come in. He just stood there, staring at me through the glass, unmoving. After about 15 seconds, he turned and walked away down the sidewalk. I stayed in that diner for 20 minutes, sipping on lukewarm coffee, heart still pounding. When I felt certain he was gone, I left and made my way to the final station where I had to clock in. It was quieter than the others, smaller and oddly darker, even with the lights on. Once inside the supervisor's office, I locked the door and immediately checked the camera feeds. There he was, 30 feet from the door. Just like before, he wasn't walking. He wasn't even pacing. He was standing still, watching. He turned to look directly into the camera, and then he didn't move. He stayed like that for a full minute, just staring. Then slowly, he lowered his head and walked out of view. I waited until sunrise before I left the office again, and when I did, I walked in the opposite direction from where I had last seen him. I kept my head down and took a different train home. I never saw him again, but I've never taken a night shift without checking the cameras obsessively ever since. Who he was, what he wanted, or why he kept following me, I'll never know. But I do know that something was wrong with him. Deeply wrong.